Hello, welcome to CSAP's Science and Policy podcast. I'm Rob Doubleday from the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge.
And I'm Emily So, Professor of Architectural Engineering at Cambridge.
This is the final episode in our mini-series, Science, Policy and Climate Resilience, which has been led by Emily over 4 episodes exploring how we can adapt and live with the impacts of climate change and how we can accelerate climate priorities after the COP26 meeting in Glasgow.
This podcast season is brought to you in partnership with the research project, Expertise Under Pressure, part of the Centre for the Humanities and Social Change at the University of Cambridge. So today, for our final episode, we're discussing how our built environment needs to adapt to the impact of climate change, what needs to be done to decarbonise the industry for our urban, rural and coastal environments, and what future development should look like in our race to resilience. We're very pleased to be joined today by Chris Wise, an award-winning designer, senior director at the consulting firm Expedition Engineering, and Peter Fisher, director at the architectural firm Bennetts Associates, both of which I'm pleased to say are certified B Corps, companies verified by B Lab to meet high standards of social and environmental performance, transparency and accountability. And I'm so pleased that both Chris and Peter are here with us today and giving us their time to talk about how, as an industry, we can do better. So welcome. I'd like to start with you, Peter, and ask you for your reflections on COP26. Given it was held in the UK, there was a lot of attention from the media before and during the meeting, but also from interest groups that perhaps were not traditionally associated with COP. And I wonder how that translated to the built environment, whether there were key commitments and also policy changes that resulted from this meeting.
There was obviously a lot of events, particularly as we have an Edinburgh office and do a lot of work in Scotland and have been heavily involved with the UK GBC for many, many years. There were a lot of events that took place around that, and particularly Edinburgh Council and Space, a pop-up exhibition centre, looked in great deal at how we retrofit historic buildings, which is a particular issue in Edinburgh. And I think that was very interesting. And there were lots of events around the built environment with the UK GBC. But in some respects, I think probably the most exciting thing for me to come out of COP26 was the Race to Zero, the initiatives from Mark Carney, and the financial drivers that were coming out of that, and particularly commitments to net zero carbon from major financial institutions. And that does begin to continue to really drive quite a lot of real estate and the demands that are placed on real estate. And I found that recently has become probably one of the greatest drivers, has been how things like the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmarking Index, etc., influence the drivers behind the major property developers. And so in some senses, that's not specifically a built environment thing, but it's more of a how the drivers are set for the built environment. And I think that's becoming an increasing motivator for what can at times feel quite optimistic in the larger end of commercial development.
And what about your reflections, Chris?
I was partly optimistic and partly realistic and a tiny bit pessimistic as a result of COP. And what I was hoping for was some real focused attention on the impact of the built environment on the climate emergency. And really, if you drill down into the detail of what was actually announced, it was, I think, 5 countries. If you look up the word concrete and COP26, you find out there were 5 countries made commitments to trying to reduce the emissions from the concrete industry, which is around about 9% of global emissions. And steel industry, ditto. Only about 5 countries actually signed up. As a result of which, we're, that 15-16% of emissions isn't really being tackled explicitly this time round through COP. So that was a bit disappointing. I mean, the UK was one of the signatories. So, but in the months since COP, there hasn't been very much action on either of those big bulk materials. So I think we're still waiting. But from the cultural point of view, I think it was good. And I agree with Peter that the levers of the economy and the financial institutions and the funders who are currently still subsidizing fossil fuels to a much greater extent than they are supporting initiatives related to net zero, there was a move where the funders, the big banks, the big financial institutions have started to realize that they have a significant responsibility and a significant part to play in trying to change the behavior and the culture of people. And if they change, if the money flow changes, then the built environment industry will also change, I think. So that gave me some sense of positivity.
I guess I'd like to pick you up on a point that you made, Chris, about the momentum, the loss of momentum. And obviously lots of things have happened since COP26 around the world. We have had to prioritise. But in terms of what the government can do, I mean, what is our status quo at the moment in terms of building regs, codes of practice in the industry, the construction industry in particular, that we should be focusing on, material use you mentioned just now. Is there anything else that we should really be paying special attention to and pushing our policymakers and the government to revise and look thoroughly at?
Yes, I think that through procurement. So central government and local government account for, I think it's 40%. If you also include maintenance, 40% of built environment spend flows through public bodies. In the Olympics and HS2 at that sort of scale, but right down to maintenance of schools and all that sort of thing. So as a commissioning body, I think that the government should be setting an example by requiring in its tender documents for people who want to work on those public projects, there should be an obligation to consultants, contractors, and also awareness on the part of the users to say that they are going to use everything they've got at their disposal to drive down emissions, to increase service life, give these projects a really long life, make them adaptable, and make them low in emissions during their use as well. And so a lot of those are technological solutions which we already have. But if the government doesn't procure projects with that as a key driver, and they may say there are sustainability targets in some of the procurement documents, but the question is whether or not they're actually being properly policed. So I think but there is an obligation, I think, to set an example. And the other thing I think that the government could usefully do is to look across multiple projects and run a really serious research stream, which says, right, how can we as a government, when we're commissioning projects, drive down carbon, drive down emissions, drive down the use of scarce resources, and not do it on an individual project basis where you tend to look at the notional cost of a project and everything's measured against that, but to look across multiple projects and say, right, what research would be really useful to drive down carbon and emissions and lifetime carbon and lifetime emissions over multiple projects, and then take those lessons and feed them back into the gene pool for everybody else to benefit from. So a research program related to that, I think, is something the government should be funding. And they will get the return many times over, even just in pure money terms. If they invest a little bit in research, they'll get a return in efficiencies and reduction in resources, which will benefit everyone.
And Peter, do you think it's the way we measure or not measure that's the problem in this country? And what are we measuring correctly, or is it the way we view embodied carbon in the industry that's setting us in the wrong direction?
I think it is about the way that we measure. And I think one of the things, building on Chris's point, that I think illustrates where it's been successful on operational carbon, and I'll come back to embodied, but on operational carbon, the Australian NABERS system, National Australian Building Environmental Rating System, which looks at in-use performance of buildings rather than merely predicting them. So, it's redone every year. The building's rental level is affected by the outcome. And I think it was either New South Wales or Victorian government then just said that they wouldn't rent any buildings below a certain standard. And that was a huge driver for the market in that part of Australia. And it led to that becoming an absolutely default standard across so many of the buildings that were being developed, being commissioned, etc. So I think it just shows that the relatively simple things, like just saying the government won't rent buildings that are below a certain environmental performance, is a starting point. I mean, as a society, I wish that we just have a carbon tax, to be honest. I think that would be the simplest thing. We could stop worrying about all manner of policy commitments and initiatives, etc., if there was just a carbon tax that began replacing income tax or something of that ilk. Something The Economist has been campaigning for years, and that would be the most simple thing, and just level the playing field. We're unlikely to get that, I suspect, in the short term. But certainly there are initiatives where some of the major developers now effectively have a shadow carbon price, which is much, much closer to what many people believe an adequate carbon tax should be priced at. So most of the major REITs have an internal shadow carbon price of somewhere between 80 and £100 a tonne of CO2, and that does influence decision making within those companies. And I think it would be a good idea if the public sector just set the same thing as well. You just put a financial cost on the release of carbon. And then the final thing I was going to return to, which is something which I think is increasingly understood within perhaps the profession and the industry of the built environment, but is perhaps not so widely understood, is the relationship between upfront and embodied carbon and then operational carbon, and the fact that the energy or the carbon emitted to construct a new building probably outweighs its ongoing operational carbon emissions at least tenfold over its lifetime, which is why the campaign for reuse and retention has got so much traction across the industry now, where we have local authorities that are beginning to make sure that planning applications at least start with a presumption in favour of retention. It has a huge influence on how you approach whether or not a building can be retained, whether or not it should be retained, and actually begins to affect land values as well. And that's often the real driver of what is done.
This carbon tax initiative or thinking is very interesting, because actually, Chris, you've been talking for years about the fact that within the industry we are an industry of oversupplying, and we design things, we over-design, we use a lot of materials, and we really don't think about questioning that. Do you see any change in the industry in the last 10 years on what we're doing? Are we using the wrong rules for designing?
Yes, I have been going on about it for a long time. I think people almost expect they'd switch off some of the time. 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I did a talk called Enough is Enough, which was to a bunch of engineers pointing, the sort of cultural issues of over-design out, because it was self-evident that engineers, for various reasons, some of them commercial, some of them to do with sleep at night factors, wanting to be ultra safe, were over-designing things. And it was to a room of relatively high-end engineers, and almost all of them ended up with their heads in their hands going, oh my God, are we really, really doing this? How are we, that was 10 years ago or 12 years ago. I think that there is a culture change. I think in the last 2 or 3 years, people have realized that engineers have a disproportionate impact on the climate emergency, and that can be negative. And maybe since the start of the Industrial Revolution, arguably for all the benefits that's brought us, it's been negative from the point of view of the climate. But it can also be positive. And a typical structural engineer is responsible for between 5 and 10,000 tons of carbon emissions through the embodied energy in the projects that they're designing each year. When if you compare that with 10 to 12 tons for an individual carbon footprint, you're 500 times to 1,000 times more influential as an engineer than as any other individual in the UK or around the planet. So, and I think we have to take that responsibility really significantly. And the issue we have, and Peter touched on it in terms of operational carbon, but we cannot see in the buildings and in the structures and the bridges and the stadia that we design, the railway stations, the hospitals, we can't see how hard they're working in terms of the embodied energy. We can't look at them and say that building has been over-designed. And if we could, I'm sure we would be horrified. I think we would go around and say, honestly, for years and years and years, we have been putting twice as much material into these buildings as we actually need. And it's time to stop. And I really think we have the technology, we know how to do it, and we should be doing it as a matter of our own professional ethical duty. So one of the things, just going back to the thing about what the government could do by way of helping this situation, is another research stream which would be really, really useful is to upskill the built environment community in being able to assess how hard or how tight, how well designed the structures are, because the structure accounts for a significant part of the embodied energy. We need to be able to hold up a phone to a building and it should glow red if that building is over-designed. Bright red if it's a 50% over-designed. It should flash red if it's 100% over-designed, and it should go green if it's working nicely in balance with the natural forces that are on it, rather than being in response to a bunch of conservative, antiquated codes of practice. Until we can see cause and effect directly like that, I don't think we are really going to change. And I think as soon as we can see that, we will be shocked and embarrassed into changing overnight, really. Of course, what you can do, you can monitor new buildings and new structures, and that does happen from time to time. But of course, those tend to have a bit of a lens applied to them from the outset. And so people are really, really careful to make sure that they tune everything as much as they can, because they know there's going to be a feedback loop. But on most of our structures, there's no obvious feedback loop apart from the fact it doesn't fall down. That's too coarse an instrument if you're looking for really highly tuned systems. I've often said, if Usain Bolt was designed by an engineer, he would be absolutely massive. He would have about 4 legs rather than 2, because of 2, just in case one of the legs didn't work properly. And he'd be able to do 100 meters in about, take him about a minute, because he'd be so heavy and so sluggish. And so we've got to get to the point where we're regarding our buildings like highly tuned athletes and get them working really well.
I was reminded of there was a brilliant exhibition recently at the Design Museum about waste. And one of the most compelling exhibits was where somebody had taken a series of recognizable products like an iPhone or a car, or the most illuminating was a vacuum cleaner and a broom, and then broken them down into the constituent materials used to make them. And they were very, very beautiful sculptures that really made very legible the materials that had gone into those. And obviously the broom was a cube of timber and some bristles and a little bit of metal for screwing them together, and that was it. And it did largely the same job as a vacuum cleaner that was all manner of complex and valuable materials, plastics, metals, etc. And it's slightly influenced by that. One thing that we've started doing is trying to visually represent the volume of materials per square meter for a building, and it is illuminating stroke slightly shocking when you see just how much material is used to create 1 square meter of a building. And so that's one thing we're trying to do more often, is try to find ways of visualize that, because I think Chris is right. It's very difficult. It's very difficult for people actually involved in that world to visualize it, let alone people who are not involved in the built environment to do so.
What does being part of the B Corps mean to you both? I mean, it's something that perhaps in the built environment and construction industry, we're quite late in adopting and looking into. Can I start with you, Chris? What motivated you to go for this accreditation, and what does it mean to you since getting it?
Well, we've been a B Corp for 2.5 years. And before that, we didn't realize, but we were behaving as a B Corp largely. If you are a benefit corporation, you have basically a triple bottom line rather than a single bottom line. So you are obliged to look to the interests on a co-equal basis of society, the environment, as well as your own stakeholders, shareholders, rather than most limited companies in the UK, for example, who only have to regard the interests, maximize the return for their shareholders. So because you have society and the environment as co-equal with the shareholders, you're obliged to think about that on every single project you do. It's a great way of keeping people's focus. It's easy to make excuses in this world and say it's somebody else's problem and that we can't influence what's going on. But I really think that if you're in a design profession like engineering or architecture, and you are able to really, and you're good at synthesis. A B Corp is a multidisciplinary activity, being a B Corp. You have to think about things which are not just a single discipline like structural engineering or architecture. You have to weave in nature, you have to weave in the end users, you have to weave in the people who are not directly part of your project but are still impacted by it. You have to really wheel in natural systems that are not part of your project but are still impacted by it. And you have to consider that as at the heart of everything that you do. That's the intention. It's very hard, I have to say, because every time you do that, you come up against custom and practice, which is still much more traditional. I mean, we're doing some projects at the moment, quite big master plan projects, where we're trying to take wider society and wider environmental systems into account in the project. But the levers that we need to do that don't exist within the setup of the project. You know, they tend to be ad hoc, unofficial, and therefore people can take it or leave it. So I think that the B Corp is a movement. It's also a code of behavior. It places obligations on the directors of our practice and Peter's practice and every B Corp to follow those rules, and for the directors to be held to account if they're not. So it means that the staff who join you and who are working with you have society and the environment front and center of everything they do every day, because that's part of the deal when you work for an organization that's a benefit corporation. So I think it's a really positive thing. There are 4,500 or so around the world at the moment. I think maybe more now. It's increasing every day. Not very many in the built environment. And the really big players are not B Corps. You know, there is no big contractor. There is no really big multi-services engineering consultancy. We're still waiting for the ripples to get up to that level. But it's going to come, because people in their corporate social responsibility obligations and in other environmental obligations, actually partly building up on COP and everything else, and the change of mindset, you're going to find that even the big organizations who are saying it's nothing to do with us, it's too difficult, they will, in the end, I think, have to play ball. So we're trying to set an example. I'm sure Peter feels the same way.
Yeah, I think, and the drivers for us were very, very similar. You know, we've long reported our impact as best we can using things like the Global Reporting Initiative and science-based targets. And in many respects, it seemed like the next logical step. And if you have been doing those aforementioned things previously, it doesn't make it that difficult to go through the initial process. In many respects, probably the most powerful thing is, as Chris alluded to, is that you literally have to rewrite the articles of association for the company to move from that focus on profit to profit, society, and the environment. And that is very, very powerful, because, as Chris said, that puts a different emphasis on what the directors of a company are responsible for. The more sort of wider interests that come out of it is, of course, that it's completely across industry, it's across nations, and I think organizations like us probably have a good sense of where we sit within, in our case, an architect's practice in the UK, and we probably know how we compare, but we don't really know where we sit vis-a-vis the globe or different types of organizations. And so there's quite a lot that can be learned across industries that are, you know, immediately outside of our own professional realm or our industry. And we found that very, very useful.
Actually, one other thing is that so when you become a B Corp, you have to be assessed. And so you have to put forward evidence as to why you are suitable. And in all of those areas, so including social and environmental impact. And when we got our score, I think we got a score of 90, which, that's fantastic. 90%, that's absolutely amazing. It turned out it was out of 200, not out of 100. So we scored 90 out of 200. That was enough to get us onto the bottom rung of the B Corp ladder. But actually, it shows how much headroom there is potentially in terms of the things that we're currently not doing, even though we may feel that we're in the built, amongst built environment companies, we may be a little bit ahead of the game. But there's plenty of headroom in terms of what other people are doing around the world, in terms of the example that they're setting and the techniques they're using. So the other good thing about B Corps is that it's a learning, sharing organization where the B Corps get together frequently, several times a year, and share knowledge and share best practice, which enables people from fashion to influence the built environment, people from the built environment maybe to influence the food tech industry or vice versa. The people from all sorts of different walks of life. And the tech transfer and the knowledge transfer is, I think, one of the strengths of the whole. It's an active, collaborative, improving organization, which I think is a very positive thing.
And I guess my question is how receptive clients, and particularly in the UK of yours, have been to the initiatives that you're both leading in your companies. Is it still the dollar sign? Is it still about, as you say, Peter, there's the profits driven in many respects, but are you optimistic about where we're heading in the next decade or so in terms of the construction?
I think I am. Now, it may be a slightly self-selecting group of clients, and there's always a danger of that quite optimistic bubble. But I think the cause for optimism within commercial real estate, and that's quite a distinct world at the moment. I say that very advisedly, but within the commercial world in workplace, our experience has been that developers are having to run increasingly quickly, and that there is increasing vast pressure on them to help tenants hit their net zero carbon targets. And it's things such as, I think the FTSE is now, I think it's something like 60% of FTSE companies have science-based 2030 net zero carbon targets. And if you take the amount of office space that will be coming free in the next few years by companies that have science-based targets, it's something like 30 million square feet in central London that organisations with net zero carbon targets will be looking for new space. There's a lot of anxiety around buildings becoming stranded assets. I think that it's almost flipped. I mean, for us, for a long, long time, you would generally say that agents are the weak link in the chain across property. It wasn't the developers themselves, it was the agents who are constantly trying to up the specification standards. You were saying that more radical solutions wouldn't sell. And if anything, that has totally flipped in the last 3 years, I'd say. And there is now enormous pressure by agents on owners of buildings to help organizations hit their net zero carbon targets. So on that basis, I'm actually quite optimistic. But I think that's yet to filter through into a residential market. Or the big problem is the existing building stock. And we don't yet have an international or a national almost infrastructure program that treats it with the scale of something like HS2. That's the sort of scale that we need. So dealing with the existing stock, I think, is very challenging. But amongst new build or substantial refurbishments, I think things look very positive at the moment. Certainly we're as busy as we've been in years with people pushing very, very challenging and ambitious briefs at us.
So we work quite a lot in the world of infrastructure, especially trying to embed good sustainable design principles into big infrastructure projects. And the challenge there is that so they tend to be funded by the Treasury. The Treasuries, they're still commissioned projects on the basis of economic advantage. Economic being usually, because it's a political decision, very often in the end tends to be economic over the life of a parliament or maybe the life of a government. So maybe 5 to 10 years rather than over the life of a project. And when you think that some infrastructure projects are designed with a nominal design life of 120 years, I haven't yet come across a project which really tackles the long-term infrastructure, climate-related impacts properly. And so, however, on those big infrastructure projects, what you are getting is an increased awareness that something has to change. And so there tend to be workshops which link together carbon and cost. So there are initiatives to say, right, how can we drive down carbon? But the subtext is, we'll drive down carbon as long as at the same time it doesn't increase cost and ideally reduces cost. And of course, actually, if you use less resources, you can bring down cost, and so everybody benefits. But it tends to be based on capital cost, much less on operational costs on infrastructure, which seems a bit crazy because the big infrastructure organizations are owner-occupiers effectively. They're going to live with the consequences of their design and construction decisions for decades. You would imagine that they would like to, invest a little bit more now and get the benefits over many, many years going forward. But that is a much harder thing to shift and I think that is partly down to the Treasury rules in terms of assessment of projects and how they are judged, which are fundamentally on operational as on CapEx, so capital expenditure rather than operational expenditure. And therefore, it's difficult to get the benefit of an investment up front if that in the end gives you a reduction in the lifetime carbon or lifetime costs. So that is a culture change that is happening. People appear to be aware of it, but they're not taking it as seriously. They don't deal with the conclusions. When the conclusion staring you in the face, invest a little bit more at the beginning and you will end up over the life of the project spending less, emitting less, and having a better functioning product. That message hasn't got through yet, and it needs to.
And I guess it's a mixture of behavioral changes, communications, ways of, as Peter was saying, visualization that would help with that. We have to come up with more innovative ways of engaging with the different players in industry. And we've all declared a climate emergency now. I fear that the momentum shifts. Sometimes we have a lot of energy and a lot of attention and awareness. Sometimes we dip in certain places because of changes of priority, the life spans of political parties and interest. What can we do in terms of the next generation and education? I mean, this is the area that I'm involved in and seeing, actually I'm enthusiastic about seeing students come up in their teenage years and the first years really wanting to push the climate agenda. What, in your views, with the last few minutes of this podcast left, are the real things that we can do with students, with education, that would prepare them for the challenges that they will face?
As you know, I taught with you and others at the department for 5 or 6 years with third-year students, and it was quite a difficult subject to embed into a curriculum at that time. And it was often seen, I think, this is across the industry. Cambridge is by no means the worst place for this, but it was often seen as an adjunct to design. It was something that happened to design rather than being something that was fundamentally embedded in it. And I think the more that students can understand the influence that they can have over the environment, the personal influence, and the way in which, particularly within architecture, I think this is very different for engineering. Within architecture, it's those very initial design thoughts or ideas that are made can hugely influence the outcome of buildings. And often, I said engineering or sustainability is something that is almost something negative that happens to buildings rather than is fundamentally part of them. And if we can get a much more holistic view from an architectural perspective, I think that just helps enormously going forward. So I think one thing that would help with that is just an emphasis or an understanding of the position that we're in, the position that society is in, and what role the built environment has within that. So in some respects, I think within architecture, it's not as much of a technical issue as it might be understood sometimes. I think it's actually a cultural issue initially. And then, is it the Peter Drucker quote that the culture eats strategy for breakfast? And I think it's probably in the built environment, it's the same with technology. If you get the culture right, the technology will follow. And probably one other thing is I always find it quite hard to use existing buildings and retention and refurb as a teaching tool. It's much easier to start with a tabula rasa and new build. In some ways, it's more interesting for people relatively early in their career, but I think we're probably moving to a point where we just have to flip that. And I'd almost like to see a part where students go through their entire architectural career and only ever look at existing buildings and how they can be reused, how they can be repurposed, because in part that also gives you many lessons about how you design good new buildings in the way that you can use existing ones.
I agree. The premise that the future of this problem is going to be survive or fall through the capabilities of the students that are coming through university at the moment. And we are in a position as older people to not to dictate to them what should happen, but to listen to what they think is important. And I think part of I'm funded by the Royal Academy of Engineering down at Bath to look at embedding regenerative design right across the engineering faculty at Bath, which includes not just architecture and civil engineering, but also mechanical engineering, electrical, electronic, chemical engineering. And because of the massive impact that all of those disciplines have. And what's really clear, and I totally agree with you, Peter, it's a cultural question first and a technical question second. The culture is, I think, you can characterize it by saying, if you want to be a really good regenerative designer, you need to be a multidisciplinary character. You need to understand and forget about individual disciplines and be a synthesizer first and a discipline specialist second, and then work out how to link specialisms together. But it's a little bit like an architectural synthesizing role, but I think it goes for, beyond architecture into other forms of design, technological design, which of course engineering has lots and lots and lots of as well. So I think it's an integrating thing, it's a synthesizing thing. I think that the other thing that I think is really important is when you are being educated, you realize the cultural context that you're working in, which includes money, it includes the users, and not the people who pay the bills, but the people who are actually going to use the project. And it includes the generations that aren't around at the moment, that are coming. And so you have to design for the unknown future to enable it effectively. So I think one of the principles of regenerative design that students, we're trying to include more of this is to design for a future that you don't know and enable as many possibilities as you can, rather than rule them out. To do that by including the people who are investing either money or reputation or hope in the projects themselves, rather than doing it on their behalf. I think it's quite arrogant for people to say, I know what the future needs, or I know what society needs. It's actually, we don't know. We need to participate with that. And when you then include the environment as well, and the big environmental systems, you then need to have, and I don't know, I haven't got very far with this one yet, but I think you need to have a way of engaging with ecosystems at a local scale, a regional scale, and right up to a planetary scale as one of your fundamental design drivers. And that needs to be in the mix as well. In the end, we need a fairly radical reinvention of the built environment education process in order to make it multidisciplinary, multifactorial, and to weave in economics, natural systems, and things way outside your individual project, the impact beyond that. And those skills don't exist yet and need to be developed. But I think it's, in order to do this properly, I think we have to embed those in the education.
And moving beyond the disciplinary boundaries and talking
Definitely
to lots more people outside of those. Thank you so much, both of you, for being with us today. Thank you to Chris Wise, Senior Director at Expedition Engineering, and to Peter Fisher, Director at Bennetts Associates, for being part of the conversation. I've learned a lot, and this is going to be a conversation that continues, and I hope that we'll be opening this up further beyond the built environment, and as Chris was saying, making those unusual alliances across the disciplines of BCops and outwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's been a very interesting conversation.
Yes, thank you. It's all the things, of course, that you are triggered by our own conversations. It's great to talk because it makes you think about what you can do next.
This series on science policy and climate resilience is brought to you in partnership with the research project Expertise Under Pressure, part of the Centre for the Humanities and Social Change at the University of Cambridge.
To hear more conversations like this, make sure you follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn.
As always, if you have any feedback or ideas you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please email inquiries at csap.cam.ac.uk.
Thank you to producer Jessica Foster and researcher Nick Kostick for the production of this series. And thanks to you for listening. We hope you have a wonderful summer. We'll be back in the autumn, and we hope you'll join us then.